Record.
Time to talk politics today on the Mindful Politics show. Because a lot of people get confused about this whole discussion of left versus right. Like, oh, it's the left versus right. Left is the problem, or the right is the problem. The answer is no. The right thinks the left is the problem. But actually, the problem isn't left or right. It's liberty versus authority. Libertarian versus authoritarian. Not libertarian, that's a party, but as in like liberty. Liberty minded versus authoritarian minded. And I'm going to give you some descriptors of what these terms mean in this context. And I'm going to explain why authoritarianism is a lot of what we're seeing, and why authoritarianism has the effect that it does. So, many people on the right, moderate right or far right or whatever you want to call it, not really far right, not the right is not a monolith, but anyways, will say the problem is the left, and the many on the left will say the problem is the right. Who was actually correct on this one? Now, right now, the problem is the authoritarian left, but the right is not exactly. When it comes to the right, the freedom-seeking right, the problem isn't the freedom-seeking right, it's the authoritarian right. You have some authoritarian right-wing, neoconservative type people who are more concerned about wars and starting wars and all this other stuff. Like people like Bill Kristol and all these other people. Basically, the Project for a New American Century this was a group that was founded, basically a neocon group. And a lot of the same people, if not from that particular company or whatever you want to call it, political group, then from that same kind of mindset of neocon parties were actually in Trump's office. Like people like Bolton and people like this. All these people were basically responsible for starting a lot of these wars, like Iraq and stuff like this. Because the problem is not the left. The problem may be, in some respects, the left currently, in this current moment. But 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the problem was actually the right, the authoritarian right, that is. And so it's not a question of it's not a problem of left versus right. It's a problem of liberty versus authority. And there's degrees of liberty and authority. It's not like when you're either liberty or authority. There's going to be times where you're going to lean to authority more, and think times where you lean more to liberty. But it's just about degrees. So how far are you willing to subject your authority upon others, force your authority upon others? And that's what we're dealing with right now. So it's not about left or right. So what do these two spectrums really mean? If you've taken the political compass, you know about the libertarian authoritarian spectrum, but I don't really think they do it justice, and I don't really think they explain it very well. So I wanted to do this to explain what these terms mean, because a lot of times the terms kind of get used, but they don't really explain a whole lot of things to most people. So I wanted to give you some one-word or two-word descriptions a bunch of these one-word or two-word descriptions that can help you understand more about what liberty and authority means, as well as why, what a liberty and authority looks like, and why that's important to understand. Because it's not just about politics. You see this. It's something. I think it plays out more in other ways as well. Like you can see a lot of this with kind of like for instance, like you may have more of a libertarian aspect when you're dealing with your friends, but maybe more of an authoritarian aspect when you're dealing with your children. Sometimes it depends on circumstances. So it doesn't just apply to politics; it applies to all kinds of things. So, what does liberty stand for? What are the one-word or two-word traits that could describe liberty? Openness, open-mindedness. If not complete open-mindedness, and enough open-mindedness to at least talk to people. You may disagree, but you can be open-minded enough to talk to people. Independent. Typically more independent thinking people are more liberty-minded. I would even say that the more liberty-minded you are, the more logical, more rational you are. There's this report. If I remember, I can actually link it in the description, but I probably won't remember because I don't remember. I have the link somewhere, but I don't really remember where it was. But anyways, I can look it up and show it on there. But anyways, so liberty is about liberty. Fairness could be a good could be a good word as well, depending on what you mean by fairness as well. There's two different kinds of fairnesses, I think. There's the proportionality kind of fairness where it's like, there's basically two kinds of fairnesses. There's the left version of fairness and there's the right version. There's the right wing and left wing versions of fairness. Left wing fairness is like fairness equally for all, while right wing, typically more right wing fairness is like fairness under proportionality, which means like if you don't do, like, say you if you like, let's take two bosses, right? And one is more of a left wing boss and one is more kind of right wing boss. And say you have 10 workers that work for this boss, and you're a worker for the boss, for the right wing boss and the left wing boss. So say you take one of these each one from each boss, and you look at what they do. Say one of them works really hard and one of them doesn't. On the left wing side, that boss is going to treat those people equally, probably even going to pay them equally, depending on certain circumstances and depending on how well they're, going and stuff like this. While the right wing boss will see that one person is working harder than the other and will reward the person who works harder than the other person more. Doesn't mean that they will, maybe they will, depends on how agreeable they are as well. If they're not as agreeable, they may even fire the other person if they're not hard working enough, if they're costing the company too much money, things like this. It's not about, and so the fairness proportionality is, or fairness quotient is different for both left and right equally. Based on the whole idea of from Righteous Mind, the book The Righteous Mind. That's where I got that idea from. But anyways, so the liberty side, depending on how, like, there's different degrees to this. Like, I'm not saying that all liberty-minded people are going to be more logical than authority-minded people, but typically speaking, more liberty-minded people are going to be more more illogical, a less, me versus you than authority-minded people. Me versus them kind of thing. Not saying that liberty-minded people we're not going to be that way. They definitely can, and they do, and they will, but it will be less so than authority-minded people. Libertarians are more rational than authoritarians, and the party libertarians are typically more rational than even the left and the right is usually, which is really interesting to me. But anyways, the authority-minded people trust. A good word for authority-minded people is trust. Trust authority. One of the really weird things that I'm noticing lately is that people will listen to the news and they'll just trust, because they don't understand that the news is not always telling you the truth, and the news is biased, and so they trust because they believe the authoritative sources are actually correct, because sometimes people will do this appeal to authority fallacy thing where they say, well, these are authoritative sources, so they must be true, they must be correct, kind of thing. There's a bunch of fallacies they kind of fall into. Illogical. Well, I don't want to say illogical. Perhaps that's the right word, but I wouldn't use the word illogical so much as I would use the word counter-logical, meaning that the authoritarians are not independent thinkers. They will basically stick with establishment or status quo type opinions and understandings, not because they are, and there's multiple reasons for why this is, but not necessarily because they are themselves status quo, but because they believe status quo, or because their family does, and they don't want to be seen to be too out of line because they're falling into authority, things like this, right? So there's different layers to this, and there's different degrees where the authority, if the authority is strong, if it's really strong, if it's stronger than liberty, for instance, typically you'll find they will stick to the party line. The right-wing authoritarian will stick more to the right-wing authoritarians, and they will probably go against the right-wing libertarian types, and then they may even go against left-wing authoritarians, but there's been less and less of that lately because they have been basically falling along the same lines lately. But anyways, authoritarians are not capable of having disagreements with people without those disagreements tearing them, just dictating what they should do. For instance, like a libertarian-minded person, you could have a disagreement with those people, and you can disagree with them, and they can disagree with you, but at the end of the day, you can still talk, and you can still hang out. Well, an authoritarian person, if you disagree with their opinions and their views, depending on how authoritarian it is, and depending on the view itself, if it's a minor view, it's a different story. It may not be as bad, but if it's a big no subject, and if you disagree with that no subject, whatever that is, then they will cut you from your life, from their life. They may even they may even call you blasphemous and all this other stuff. Depending on what kind of authoritarian the person is, they'll call you a Nazi. They'll call you all these names because they don't think independently. They can't think independently because their very selves are involved in this process. There's a good book, actually, if you want to check it out. It's kind of new agey, but some good points in it. I think it's a really good point. It's a really good book to explain how attachments work. But it's called The 5 Levels of Attachment. And basically, there's 5 different levels of attachment. It's the guy. I think it was one of the guys who wrote. I think it was either his son or it was him, but his father or something along those lines wrote the 4 agreements. And this book in particular was really interesting because it makes you understand how attachments work and things like this. But anyways, the agreement or the agreements, I guess you could say, of authoritarians are: if you give me security, you mean the government, I will trust you, protect you, believe you, etc., etc. Trading freedom for security, things like this. Like the whole war on terror is caused by authoritarian right, at least at the first. Now it's more caused by authoritarian left, because the left doesn't understand that, I don't know what happened over the past 20 years, but the left has become the more authoritarian, while the right has, some authoritarians, but most of these are neocons, oddly enough. Like the newer, even though the neocons are actually not that new anymore. Like the neocons were new back in the 90s and the 2000s, but now the new conservatives are more actually like libertarian minded. It's really funny. And so the neocons, I guess you could call them, are like, a lot of them aren't even like purely like party line driven right. They're just not left. They're not, like the whole hashtag walk away campaign is a good example of how this kind of works, where they may not be completely right. They may even have some left-wing issues, but they agree on certain things, and they can, because of that, they have created a sort of group behind themselves. And like I said, they may disagree on some things, but they can talk about it, and they can joke about it and joke with themselves and others at the end of the day, kind of thing. While the authoritarians cannot do that, because it doesn't serve their worldviews and their narratives to do this. The authoritarians are not concerned with freedom for the most part. They're more concerned with towing the line of the party, of the company, of the whatever the news is saying, things like this. And the authoritarian right isn't always pro-establishment. They often are, but some of them are actually more like pro-establishment, Trump, in a sense you could call it that. But it doesn't mean that they're not wrong. It doesn't mean that they are libertarian, because Trump was kind of authoritarian in a lot of ways too, which is really interesting. But anyways, it doesn't mean that they are establishment. Some authoritarians are not pro this establishment, but they're pro another kind of establishment. The establishment of Trump being back in office or whatever. But those people are rarer than the other types. The ones that I've seen most often are like more of this new group that are more kind of libertarian, like Dave Rubin type people, who will disagree with you, but at the end of the day will still talk to you and still joke with you and stuff. And they're not even right wing, like people like Joe Rogan, for instance. Like, he's not right wing at all, but he is not authoritarian, and he's pretty libertarian on a lot of issues. But but has no sympathy with the right wing for the most part. Not that he's like against the right wing, but you know what I mean. He's not like a Trump supporter or anything. I mean, even though the media will try and tell you that he is and that he eats, horse paste and all this other stuff. It's ridiculous. All this stuff they were trying to tell about what he was doing. Like when he had COVID, they were saying he was, eating horse dewormer and all this other stuff. And it's like, that's not at all what he was doing. But anyway, but anyways, the authoritarians will listen to that and they will believe it. They'll trust it. Libertarian-minded person will listen to it. They may believe it, but then they will look it up and they will, make sure. Depending on how libertarian-minded they are and depending on how much authoritarianism is in their profile, so to speak. And I think it depends, too, on issue from issue to issue. Like, you may be more libertarian on, like, economical issues, but more authoritarian about things like critical race theory and things like this, and mask mandates and stuff like this, where it's like no mask mandates, no critical race theory and stuff like this. I'm not saying that critical race theory is at all a good thing, but there are different levels of how libertarian and authoritarianism can show up within your worldview. But the major difference is that the general libertarian-minded person is not as, authoritarian as an authoritarian person. The more authoritarian you get, the more radical you get. Oftentimes, I find the most radical people I've seen are authoritarians. There's no radical libertarians. I mean, there are like anarcho-capitalists and people like that, but they're not really radical as in like violent. Like most ANCAPs that I've ever seen online, they're just kind of talking about how government is bad and taxation is theft. It's like not that big a deal. I mean, there may be some that are violent, but I've never heard of any case of a libertarian, especially a really extreme level libertarian, being radically violent. I mean, maybe there is a couple of cases, but it's rarer than like more authoritarian radicalists, because the libertarian understands, like, it's really interesting to me, like, because the libertarian ideal is that you can actually, like, if a libertarian actually has a government, if they set up a government, you can literally practice socialism within a certain area if the people agree and whatnot, for the most part, and if it doesn't violate certain, non-aggression principles and things like this. You can practice it, and you can practice it within that libertarian system. And so libertarianism, while it can be like radical as in like, not radically as in radical as in violent, but radical as in like radically different from what most people would agree is correct or right, or something that should be done or whatever. But while they may be radical in that sense, they will honor freedom more than they will honor authoritarianism. But the authoritarian radical will not, and will be more violent than the libertarian radical. And so I don't even know if the word radical is even the right word for a libertarian who is more extremely libertarian speaking. So the authoritarian kind of can create more of a bubble around himself. Not that the libertarian-minded person can't do that as well, because like I said, with certain issues, you're going to be more authoritarian than other issues. And when I mean authoritarian, I don't mean like, all I really mean in this case is like, you're not willing to bend as much as in other areas. Like, for instance, a libertarian may not be willing to bend on like the non-aggression principle, but he can bend when it comes to other people practicing that, as long as they're not violating him. And they'd rather not violate other people, but if they do, they do, and then people can deal with that within the confines of the non-aggression principle, basically. And but the authoritarian cannot bend and must make his opinions that are given to him by establishment law. They must be made law. They must be made national, like vax mandates and all this other stuff. Despite the fact that vaccines could have things that you're allergic to. It's possible that people have allergies to something that's in the COVID vaccine. And if you are for the vax mandate, you may not be aware of this. And so another thing that could separate libertarian-minded people from authoritarian-minded people is nuance. Libertarian-minded people can see and understand nuance more than authoritarian-minded people. Authoritarian-minded people are more black and white. Like I said, this usually goes, from what I've noticed, from issue to issue. Like, most people are not going to be fully libertarian or authoritarian. Most people are going to be kind of like libertarian on some issues, but authoritarian on other issues. And the degree to which you're more libertarian or authoritarian has nothing to do with you being generally more libertarian than other issues, it has nothing to do with you being generally more libertarian than authoritarian. It has more to do with how many issues are you a little bit more libertarian on, and how many issues are you a little bit more authoritarian on. If you care about, like, say, 10 issues, and you are libertarian on like 7 of those issues and authoritarian on 3 of those issues, you're typically more libertarian minded. Like I said, this doesn't mean that you're not authoritarian. You can't have authoritarian authority. I don't want to say authoritarian, but authority like qualities. It just means that you have less of them than a typical authoritarian minded person would.
4:02 p.m. Right. Record.
So the basic differences, from what I've noticed, are individualism versus collectivism. Typically speaking, authoritarians are more collective. At least partially. Or they're more, versus libertarians that are more individualistic. So, it may not be fully like collectivism, as in like the left version of collectivism, where there's 2 basic forms of collectivism, or what you could call nationalism versus like internationalism. Those are basically the 2 collectivism stances. Now, you can be a libertarian and be a nationalist. There's not a difference there. But there's a certain level of collectivism that you kind of create when you're authoritarian. It's more about the collective rather than it is about the individual. Wow, for the libertarian, it's more about the individual versus the collective, over the collective. It's really interesting, actually. One of the weird things that I've noticed about authoritarians is that they tend to stick to their party line, whatever that is. People who say that people have no principles, who, like, if their party says this, but then they don't do something else, if they don't criticize that and they know about that, that's an authoritarian-minded person. That's more of a collectivist. Authoritarian and collectivist isn't completely synonymous, but in a lot of ways they do tend to overlap in a lot of ways. Not that a libertarian-minded person cannot be collectivist, but the collectivism is presented differently. If, like, somebody is more left libertarian, for instance, the person is going to be collective, but it's more about kind of like a, you almost could call it an individualist collective stance, where it's like, it's not about making mandates and making government rules. I mean, that can be part of it, but really what it's about is cooperation. Like, if you have 8 people on a farm, how do you divide the labor up properly so that it's fair and even for all people involved? That's kind of like a collectivism stance in some regards. I mean, it can get more or less collectivist depending on how libertarian you are. And not that libertarians can not be collectivist, but their collectivism, if they have any at all, is more based on individual rights than collective rights. I might make an episode about collectivism versus individualism in another time, but the authoritarians have this tendency to radicalize. It's really interesting. So there's different metrics here, because it's not just authoritarian and libertarian. There's the radical hearing, radical speech, which typically is more authoritarian, but isn't, completely just an authoritarian thing. But and it makes sense why this would be, right? Because the more authoritarian you are, the more radical you're probably going to be, because the reason why authoritarians are authoritarians is because they think that their authoritarianism is correct for whatever reason. Like, say if you have a position that's very authoritarian, where it's like, this must be done government-wise, this mandate must happen, it's because you think it's important. It's not because you're, evil or, whatever it is that some people want to say. It's because you think it's genuinely important. It doesn't mean you're correct, but it does mean that you think it's important. And that's part of the problem, is that it's emotion. Usually authoritarianism is more emotion over logic. Authoritarians are usually more nationalistic. Not, like I said, not that libertarian-minded people can't be nationalistic, but typically speaking, the more nationalistic you are, the more authoritarian you can kind of become. Or if you're not nationalistic, you'll be internationalistic, or you'll be, collectivist in a different way. If it's not about, like, the country, like, with the left, it's not really about the country. It's about the ideology. And so it's, what would be the right word for it? But nationalism in the sense of ideologism. But basically, like, you have how you have with nationalism. It's about, the country being loyal to the country, being loyal to the government, supporting the government, trusting the government, being proud of the government, things like this. For a leftist who's more authoritarian, it's about the ideology itself and the collective message of this ideology. And so if it's not about nationalism, it's more about collectivism. You know, a nationalist is typically more authoritarian than a libertarian. You know, a libertarian, typically the more libertarian you get, the more you're for open borders in some way. You know, for different reasons than the left is, actually. But, you know, like the more libertarian you get, like anarcho-capitalists especially, the more open borders you want, because it helps business and it supports businesses and you know, things like this. And so the capitalist, the thing that to understand here is that the capitalist minded people aren't actually libertarians. Not all of them. A good number of them are actually authoritarians because they believe in, you know, they believe in, you know, protectionism, which is almost more authoritarian speaking. You know, typically, you know, the more libertarian you are, the more against tariffs you are. You know, especially the party libertarian is against tariffs and all the stuff that we have. But like I said, it's usually issue to issue, because usually what most people aren't like the Libertarian Party, capital L. They're more libertarian leaning on some issues and authoritarian leaning on other issues. You know, because most people, left and right, typically are for tariffs, even though tariffs don't really work. But that's another episode. Anyways, and so that's kind of more authoritarian, because tariffs enforce something. You have to enforce something. It's one of the reasons why libertarians, a lot of the more extreme ones, say that taxation is theft, because it's a kind of force in a sense. Is it right? Is it wrong? I don't know. You know, there's been times in the past where I've been against libertarians, but you know, the more that I've looked at libertarianism, it makes more and more sense. You know, I'm not fully sold in everything because I am more center left-ish, but I think the ideals of libertarianism make sense in certain ways, and I might make episodes on this on future, or might make future videos on this. But the libertarian mindset equals independence, freedom, autonomy, which I guess is kind of the same thing. It is a bit different because autonomy usually has more to do with states and provinces and whatever you want to call your area. You know, some people, most areas I think call them provinces, but you know, like if you're in Canada or something. But anyways, autonomy. They usually are more independent thinkers than authoritarians. Authoritarians usually are very, very, very dedicated to their ideology, whatever that ideology is. Depending on how authoritarian you are, depending on how radical you are. And it's kind of an interesting thing because it's not a black and white issue. It's not like you're going to be 100% libertarian or authoritarian on all issues. Like even on certain issues, you're going to be like, to a certain degree libertarian, or to a certain degree more authoritarian. You know, more libertarian or more authoritarian. It's not going to be 100% libertarian or authoritarian for the most part. There may be some issues where that will happen, like, you know, the war on drugs and things like this. But typically it's more kind of like shades of gray, like how far libertarians are you willing to go here depends on your point of view and whatnot. And so I'm actually really against this whole left-right paradigm anymore, because it really doesn't mean anything anymore. You know, because the left will tell people who are typically more in favor of left-wing policies that they're right when they disagree with, like, the big things that the left now supports. Whatever those things are. Nowadays, like Black Lives Matter and all this other stuff, and like defunding police and all this crazy shit that the left is supporting. Critical race theory. And so, the reason why is because they're authoritarians. They've become the authoritarians. The authoritarians used to be the right, especially like the neocons, like Bush and Cheney. Before that it was people like Reagan. They had that incident with what was it? Where they had that Iran-Contra affair where they were selling weapons to Nicaragua, and some kind of paramilitary force in Nicaragua to stop Iran or whatever it was, some crazy shit, which is a very authoritarian sounding thing. It's very against the non-aggression principle. If I know my non-aggression principle, which I'm pretty sure I do. And so the authoritarians are typically more, they're going to stick to the ideology, the party line, whatever that is. And the reason for this is because they are authoritarians. It's kind of like a vicious circle, because the more authoritarian you are on a certain issue, the more you will stick to your bias on this issue. Like if you see something, for instance, that goes against this issue, this bias, you're going to, in your head, and I've done this myself, comment on it, and then maybe even out loud comment on it and say, this is wrong, this is bad, and this is stupid. Over the past couple of years, what I've done is try not to do as much of that. My content on this show and on my podcast, The Specifist, has gotten way better. There's been a lot more development as far as that goes. There's a lot more productivity as well. There's more information you're going to get in a lot of ways from these platforms, YouTube and podcasting. And the reason is because I've become more libertarian over the years, because I've realized the problems with radical authoritarianism. And I might make a separate episode on this, or maybe make a separate segment on this and put it on this video as well. But anyways,
Right. Recording duration creativity on Pro.
I'll end this segment here, and I might come back to it later, to this video later.
But creativity on.
So
Left channel. Recording duration 2 seconds. Pro.
I think I'm going to just end this episode here, because it is already about 42 minutes long, and I try not to keep these over an hour. I try that with my podcast as well. I've actually gotten better at that, but apparently not on this show. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will try and make more videos in the future, because it is kind of a fun thing to do. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing, and if you really liked it, and if you're brave, consider sharing with someone that you think would enjoy this. I know how difficult that can be in this kind of climate and political climate that we're in right now. But I think we need more politics that's more rational like this, and less emotional like this one. It's what I try and deliver with my content. Because otherwise, what you get is you get screaming, you get yelling, and that doesn't really fix anything. That doesn't really solve the problem. And it ends up making things worse. So, anyways, hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll talk to you in the next one.